In 1967, Ayn Rand was a guest on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, a talk show beamed into the homes of tens of millions of Americans. The audience reaction was extraordinary, and she appeared 3 times in 4 months. Today, the Ayn Rand Institute is proud to publish those 3 interviews with the kind permission of Carson Entertainment Group, the copyright owner. 2 of these interviews are rare finds. One appears in print in Objectively Speaking, and the other has not been published, nor has been publicly available until today. Using YouTube's Premiere function, we're featuring those 3 interviews and we'll be publishing them back to back in about 30 minutes. And we invite you to stay on and join the watch party. As we count down to that launch, we're going to go behind the scenes of those interviews, take a look at how they came about, foreshadow some of the topics, and discuss Ayn Rand's appearances and where this was during her career. Welcome. I'm Elan, Journo, and I'm joined today by my colleague, Tom Bowden. Hi, Tom.
Hi, Elan. Good to be here.
It's great to have you. I wanted to talk with you because you did so much work on this article about Ayn Rand's appearances on The Tonight Show for New Ideal, our journal. And I was really excited to read the article. I really enjoyed it. I thought it was terrific. I'm encouraging everyone who's watching to go and take a look at it after the countdown and after the watch party. So I thought, let's dive in a bit and help people just contextualize the importance of these interviews that Ayn Rand did. Let me start with this question. I know a lot of people who are going to be watching this are going to be saying, Johnny Carson, who? Who is this guy? Maybe their parents have heard of him, but they don't know. So who was he? How big a deal was he back in 1967?
Yeah, that makes me feel very old. But if you take Stephen Colbert and Jimmy Kimmel and Jimmy Fallon, roll them all up into one, that's Johnny Carson. He was the king of late night. And we're going back 55 years, okay, to 1967. He didn't really have any competition. He was well on his way to becoming, the king of late night. That's what they called him. His ratings were better than anybody's. He was, and if you're not familiar with Johnny Carson, you got to check him out on YouTube. He's a very funny guy, but very approachable, very middle America. So he was famously able to relate to everybody of all political persuasions. It was in the era before everything was politically charged. The Tonight Show, Johnny Carson had taken over in 1962, so that was 5 years later. He had built great ratings. He had just come off of a contract dispute where he was getting paid a lot more money. He was really in the driver's seat in making this show something that was going to explode over in the 1970s and 1980s and 1990s. So he was the key. If you wanted to be on late night TV to advertise your book, as Ayn Rand did, then his is the show you wanted to be on.
So Tom, let's paint a picture of what the media landscape was back then, because I can tell you my kids have no idea what broadcast TV is. They're too young for that. And back then, obviously, there was no internet. There was nothing like YouTube, nothing even remotely. How many channels did people have to choose from back then on television?
Well, you talk about the landscape, it's kind of like a desert landscape where, one of those mesas is sticking up and there's another one over here. So you had 3 or 4 TV channels maybe in this barren landscape, barren relative to what we have today. And the thing that's remarkable to me to think about is that if you were going to watch The Tonight Show, it started at 11:30 at night. You had to have your rear end in a seat or be lying in bed and looking at the TV to see it. And in this case, Ayn Rand's first appearance I'm pretty sure was like 12:30 to 1 o'clock. So, and if you weren't watching it then, you missed it. There was no YouTube to see a highlight. You might find a rerun months in the future. Not only were there very few channels, but the synchronous nature of it, you had to be watching when they were broadcasting, made it very kind of, we talk about the mainstream media as a gatekeeper, and they were a gatekeeper, and they still are to some extent. But now we have so many ways around the gate, so many holes in the fence, for a famous person or somebody trying to be famous, like a Joe Rogan or a Jordan Peterson. They have all sorts of avenues now to go directly to people and spread an intellectual message Ayn Rand didn't have that. She had to, earn her way onto national TV, which she did. But the contrast with the landscape is there is no social media, so you really had to work to get your message out.
And of course, as you were saying, the broadcast nature of it, the best you could hope for was a rerun, because this was before the advent of VCRs or home record. What today we would call a DVR, but back then it was actually a cassette that you had to put in your. So those didn't exist in many people. I think if you wanted to record something, you'd have to get a movie camera and point it at your TV, and I don't think many people were doing that kind of thing. So let's talk a little about where Ayn Rand was in her career. So set the stage. So Atlas Shrugged is published in 1957. So this is 10 years since. What is she doing? Where is this? What is she busy promoting?
Yeah, I think the most useful way to look at it is, in 1957, Ayn Rand's career as a writer of fiction ended, and her second career, if you want to call it that, as a writer of nonfiction started. So she made herself into a public intellectual, or almost a cultural icon. She began speaking on college campuses all over the Ivy League, Harvard and Yale and Princeton, and then out in the big state schools like Michigan and Wisconsin. She appeared on national TV, like Mike Wallace Show was one of the first ones she appeared on. She gave an interview to Playboy magazine in 1964. So she was a big deal in the culture. But again, on the premise of writing nonfiction, so applying her philosophy of objectivism to current events, to elections, to the war, to whatever was happening in the culture. And she had started her publication, the Objectivist newsletter, which changed format into the Objectivist. That was 1962. It started same year Johnny Carson started on The Tonight Show. And it had become the Objectivist in 1967, basically the same magazine. And she was writing essays in there, and then these essays would be collected into books like The Virtue of Selfishness, and the one that came out in 1966, just before this first appearance, Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal. So she was, she was self-promotional in the sense that she wanted to put her message out there, and she wanted to, she knew that she was an expert at, how to get publicity and what was good publicity and what was bad. And so she wanted to, the way this particular interview came out is that her book, Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, as I say, came out in 66. It was just coming out in paperback, I think, in 67. And so I feel sure that we don't have exact archival evidence of it, but I feel like the publicist for the book probably reached out to Johnny Carson. And Johnny Carson's bookers would have been aware of Ayn Rand. She was kind of a big deal. And so they took a chance on having her on because, she's not like, if you look at the people who had multiple appearances on Johnny Carson, it would be a comedian like Buddy Hackett might be on, every month for 3 months or something, or Joan Rivers, or comedians or actors or whatever. You didn't really have a lot of serious philosophers and novelists with a Russian accent on national TV. So it was kind of a risk for them to reach out to her. But that's how the interview came about in August of 1967.
And just to add to what you're saying, spend some time on YouTube and look up some old Johnny Carson clips from The Tonight Show. You'll get a sense, I think he called it, correct me if I'm wrong, Tom, but he called it like a wild and crazy show or something along those lines. And you get clips of him doing costumes and skits. And it's sort of not exactly a variety show, but it has touches of that. And so it's very lighthearted, very comical typically. So this was a contrast for the show when Ayn Rand came on.
Yeah, it was definitely a contrast. He had on some what you would call intellectuals or public intellectuals or authors of nonfiction, but for somebody like Ayn Rand to come on, not just once, but be invited back twice, meant that she was causing a stir. And we would say the reaction to her appearances went viral because, in those days, the feedback you got was letters to Johnny Carson and to Ayn Rand, and phone calls. And both the Carson show and Ayn Rand were inundated with audience response. And we feel sure that that was a big reason why he had her back 2 times for a total of three appearances.
And I think in your article, you make the point that Ayn Rand got so many letters and interest in her publication. So I think she got some subscribers joining the Objectivist newsletter. And there were so many letters and I think she was often writing personally in response to fan letters. But at this point, there were so many in reaction to these interviews that she did on Johnny Carson. She had to do a form letter. In the article, you call it a dear friend letter. So what was that about? What does that look like exactly?
Yeah, she had a dear friend letter, and it was essentially, thank you for your response, and here's a free copy of the article that I wrote about, called Requiem for Man, I think was the article, which was her criticism of the Pope's encyclical against capitalism. And I think where it ties in to me, where it's interesting, is that she was very clear in her interviews, that you can't, she couldn't convey the whole essence of her philosophy. So the first thing Johnny Carson asks her in the first appearance is, "What's your philosophy?" Well, how are you going to say that? But she's very clear that you can't say it all in a few minutes on a talk show. But here's where you go to find out the facts. In that case, read Atlas Shrugged. And she was very clear when talking about the Pope's encyclical that you need to go to the Objectivist and read my article to get the full context. So she's a thinker, she's not treating ideas casually. She's treating these things seriously and respecting the audience's context. I don't expect you to agree with me based on 5 minutes on Johnny Carson, but you do need to read and think about these issues for yourself.
I just want to plug your article one more time, because there was something that really struck me in reading it. You mentioned there's an anecdote. So a lot of the material in the article is from the Ayn Rand archives. You did a lot of research there, and we're really glad to be able to have that resource. It's the world's most comprehensive resource of Ayn Rand materials. And one of the things that struck me is I think it's a bookstore in Arizona. So the manager, maybe I'm not getting the exact anecdote, but a bookstore owner is quoted in a paper saying, after this interview, there was a run on Ayn Rand's nonfiction books. If we had more copies, we would have sold them, and particularly the hardcover, which are always more expensive than the print. So I think if Ayn Rand's goal was to get more people to notice her work and to go and engage with it, I think that definitely there's evidence that happened.
Well, that's right. And you had Johnny Carson not only holding up Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, but holding up mentioning her magazine, The Objectivist, mentioning that she's the author of Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead, and him being very complimentary of her. And I think, these interviews are so fascinating. I think there's a number of things that you can really listen for and watch for. Now, we've got 1 video and 2 audios, right? So you talked about the technology. Somebody in 1967 took a kinescope, before you even had VCR cameras, took a kinescope and took a picture of the interview. But NBC's policy, was to reuse its videotape, for new episodes. So the second 2 episodes were lost on video. But what you had is people taking, recordings off the air. And this would be a good time, I think, to show a couple of the pictures that we have of Ayn Rand on The Tonight Show, because this, once again, is just people, somebody had a camera, and they took a picture of the TV set, and then they took the roll of film and they took it down to the drugstore, and a few days later they got the paper pictures back, and the fan, put them in an envelope and sent them to Ayn Rand and said, "This is what you look like on The Tonight Show." So this is like this technology. It's laughable how primitive it is compared to what we would do today. But this is her in the August, with Johnny Carson in the August 11th, 1967 appearance, which is my birthday, by the way. And like I say, I missed this appearance. I wish I'd seen it. I think, the next photo is her looking very intently at Johnny Carson. And, as you're listening to these things, watch for her temperament and for her demeanor. It's just very serious, but very friendly and very open and very logical, reasoned, emotional, when called for and so forth. So it's really, Um, a lot of things to watch for. This is another one. Now, it's interesting. We have two other pictures that we know are October and December, but we don't know which is which. So if anybody was around or alive at the time and remembers what she was wearing in October versus December. So this is one of the either the second or third appearance in that very remarkable kind of dress that you don't see Ayn Rand in kind of 1960s dress. You know, I don't recall seeing her. So that just that picture alone is worth 1,000 words. And then the next one is kind of a, I don't know what you call that kind of a dress, a shift or an A-line or something. But again, it's the kind of dress I don't recall seeing her in before. So that's what she looked like on the Tonight Show. But you'll get to see what she looked like and what she sounded like. And I think some other things to watch for on the, or listen for on the interviews are just how kind of calm, rational, and I don't know, intellectually serious and exploratory these conversations were. So Johnny Carson asked good questions, but he let her say her piece, and he would come back at her with, you know, objections and so forth. But it was all very respectful. And Ayn Rand said at some point during these interviews, I'm always happy to discuss ideas, but not to debate them. And I think part of what she meant by that is she didn't want to elevate other, you know, opposing views and give them the platform that she had earned. You know, she wanted a platform to talk about her ideas, and which brings up the idea of ground rules. I don't know if you want to discuss that for a minute, but
yeah, let's come to that in just a second. I want to come to that in just a second, but I want to remind everyone who's watching, we're counting down. In about 12, 13 minutes, we're going to roll over to the YouTube premiere of these 3 1967 interviews with Ayn Rand appearing on Johnny Carson's Tonight Show. And thank you all for being here. Thank you for all of you who are donating in support of the Ayn Rand Institute's work to bring Ayn Rand's ideas to a larger audience. We invite you to support our work. We're grateful for those of you who already are contributing to our mission. We really appreciate that. And as I said, we're on a clock, and we're going to try to hit the mark exactly right. So there's so much more we want to talk about. Now, I'll remind everyone that we'll put a link to this in the YouTube description as well for those who want to follow up. Tom has a really excellent article about this in our journal, New Ideal. After you watch the interviews, go read the article. We'd love for you to take a look at that, and eager to hear your feedback. I want to circle back to one more thing before we go to the ground rules, Tom. I want to go back to, you mentioned the Pope's encyclical, and this is 1967, and I believe this was one of the years, so the Vietnam War was raging. America was in turmoil over the Vietnam War. This was the biggest issue, arguably, at the time. I think the death toll that year was probably the highest it was up to that point. I'm not sure if it got higher. So there was a lot of focus on the Vietnam War, and the Pope's encyclical was another. So, you know, the Pope's standing in the culture was probably higher than it is today. More people paid attention to him as an intellectual, sort of spiritual leader. And so Ayn Rand discussed both those issues in these interviews, and it's interesting. So you suggested things for people to notice. Give us a sense for some of the topics that she talks about, because she didn't hold back. She never compromised her message. And yet, and this goes back to the point we were talking about earlier, where the reaction was really strong and positive, and not always positive, but it was interesting to notice this on the show as well. So give us a sense of some of the topics, just to kind of the headline level, and where she stood on that.
Yeah, I think you'll see on the one of the recordings, when she expressed a certain opinion, Johnny Carson came in and said, now there was some applause, and then I heard some boos in there, and he said, that's what you're going to have when you have controversial opinions being expressed, and that's why we're here. And so, again, kudos to Johnny Carson for being, you know, willing to air the views of this controversial speaker. So, you know, so start from the beginning. You know, here's Ayn Rand summarizing objectivism with its ethics of rational self-interest. So right away, you know, selfishness is and you know, life on earth and atheism, you know, all these controversial elements Ayn Rand is getting out. In terms of what was going on at the time, certainly, you know, this was the 1960s, so she had already written about and gone through the hippies and the campus rebellions and all of that. She had nothing good to say about the student protesters who were against the Vietnam War because they were more sympathetic to the communists. Her point about the Vietnam War is that it was not to our self-interest to be in Vietnam. We had nothing to gain from it. And that was her opinion as to why we should not be there, which of course was exactly the opposite. People said we had a lot to gain from it, the opponents. So the Vietnam War and the military draft closely allied to that. She said, you know, nobody has a right to take the life of another person. And if 2 billion or people gang up on that individual, it doesn't give him any more right to take his life through conscription. So the military draft, the Vietnam War, the Pope, I mean, the United Nations, I mean, her strong opinion that the United Nations should not exist. United States should not be a member of it. And then there's a whole litany of other issues. I mean, just the array of issues that she addressed is extraordinary. But you never felt labored, like she was trying to get to the next point or something. All these things just came up because everything was integrated in her point of view, and she would have to make this or that controversial point. And I have at the end of my article, I have a place you can tap and expand to see all the additional, besides the big issues that I just mentioned, just dozens of other issues that came up where she would express her opinion. So you just have to listen for how she communicated this controversial philosophy. You know, Ayn Rand as a person, as the spokesperson for her philosophy, is just something to behold that you don't necessarily get in reading the things that she wrote.
So I want to come back to your point about ground rules, and I've had different experiences in interviews, and I've worked on the other side of this, getting people to do interviews, and I know that it's a common practice for people who do interviews to set certain ground rules or conditions for their appearances. You know, celebrities and musicians and actors, it's a very common thing. It varies obviously from individual to individual. Tell us a bit about how Ayn Rand approached that issue.
Well, I think for a lot of celebrities and so forth, it would be, don't talk about my ex-wife, or don't talk about my, you know, heroin scandal or whatever it might be. But with Ayn Rand, you know, she wanted to get her ideas across, and ideas were precious to her, and the communicating of them was something that you had to do properly and seriously. And to be subject to attacks, to be fending off attacks, and quotes from your enemies and barbs from the host and so forth. She just didn't want that. And so, you know, you'll hear Johnny Carson say that the one rule she laid down for him was, don't attack me personally. Just don't attack me. You can ask me questions about my ideas and challenge me, but don't attack me. That was one of her clear rules, but her other ground rules had to do with just, let's have a serious intellectual discussion, you know, not down to personalities, not quoting my enemies and so forth. And she put these ground rules out, you know, routinely. And as a result, the interviews that she did do did live up to her standards, you know, and allowed her to get her point of view across. The contrast I like to draw is in a footnote in my article is the Dick Cavett story. So the Dick Cavett show came on in 1970, I think it was, and invited her to appear. You know, they would have been aware that she was on Johnny Carson. And she sent them normally her ground rules. It was just 5 or 6 ground rules written. And Dick Cavett and his producer sat around and kind of chuckled and laughed at this and said, there's no way we're going to agree to these rules. And so she was never invited on the show. But the kicker, the punchline is, years later, Dick Cavett was interviewed, and he was recalling this thing and said, yeah, we looked at these ground rules and we said, no, this would not work, because I was lying in wait, you know, to ambush her. I was laying for her. I wanted, you know, I had no respect for her as a writer or a thinker, and I wanted to get at her. So the ground rules, you know, come in handy and really help protect the reputation and presentation of a serious writer like Ayn Rand.
Well, I want to just suggest, as people watch the interview and then listen to the two that follow, And you can hear this in all of them. There's an interesting rapport that Johnny Carson builds with her, and he's quite respectful. But he doesn't agree with everything she has to say, and he comes up with really interesting questions along the way. So it doesn't have the feel of a lot of the interviews you watch now on late night. They seem like they were scripted by the press agent of the person appearing, and it's, beat by beat, we know what we're going to say. This is much more dynamic, and it seems authentic in the sense that he's really interested. What do you think about this controversial thing? How do you respond to that? So Tom, we're almost at the time, so I want to just hand it back to you and just get a sort of final thoughts from you before we wrap up.
Apropos of what you were saying, toward the end of the last December interview, Johnny Carson asks her some questions about his son struggling with foreign language requirements at college. And I got the impression, I can't prove it, but it seemed spontaneous. It didn't seem like even a rehearsed question that they had gone through in a pre-interview or anything. And Ayn Rand has some very interesting things to say about education that I'm not sure were pre-planned, but that's something to look forward to. One other little thing I want to mention is as you watch these things, there's a little closed caption CC button at the bottom of YouTube. If you're having any trouble, following her, even if you don't think you are, push the closed caption and have the captions come up, because everything is a lot clearer when you're seeing the exact wording on the screen. I'm just so thrilled to be able to write about and to experience these interviews. For the first, it's 55 years. I think what you said before, Johnny Carson said, this is kind of a crazy entertainment show, and you're right. That's basically what it was. But he was serious enough to want to. It was kind of an example of how a thinker coming on like Ayn Rand could elevate the genre, and give some people in their living rooms and bedrooms, the unexpected, a philosopher talking to me about really important things. I think we know at least one person who got turned on to Ayn Rand from actually watching these Johnny Carson experiences. So I don't know. I think you need to listen, watch, and judge for yourself how Ayn Rand projected her philosophy. I think these interviews really give you a great opportunity to do that.
Well, thanks, Tom. Thanks for sharing everything you've written about and you've discovered, and some of these sidelights and behind-the-scenes perspective. Really appreciate that. Go read Tom's article after you join us at the watch party, which will start in just a moment. And I want to just thank everyone who's supported the Institute with donations today. And if you want to support our work, you can do it through YouTube now, or you can go to aynrand.org/donate and help us bring Ayn Rand's books and ideas to more people and larger audiences across time. The YouTube premiere will begin momentarily. For those of you watching live, just give your screen a moment or two to reload at the appointed time, and then we will be with you in the chat in the watch party. Thank you all for joining us.